Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us for the online NARM Basics training to become a NARM-informed professional. This is the Level 1 training in the neuroaffective relational model for helping professionals work with complex trauma. This professional training is designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. This training is for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. In this online training, participants will learn more about the changing field of trauma, a deeper understanding of the impacts of ACEs and complex trauma, and how NARM, one of the first models specifically designed to address complex trauma, can support professionals in the growing trauma-informed field. The next online NARM Basics training is starting in September 2022 and will run 1 weekend a month through December 2022. 60 continuing education units will be available for most helping professionals. Register now to reserve your spot. We hope you will join us in learning how to transform trauma. For more information and to apply to the online NARM Basics training, please visit narmtraining.com/online basics. And now for our interview. Iya Affo is a culturalist and historical trauma specialist who studies different cultures that have been impacted by oppression and collective trauma. Iya deeply understands the commonalities and also the differences for these various cultural experiences of trauma. Iya earned Western certification as a trauma specialist, a certified trauma and resilience life coach, and a certified facilitator of trust-based relational intervention. Iya is a descendant of the long line of traditional healers from the Benin Republic, West Africa, and has visited more than 25 countries around the world, residing in Native American, Yoruba, Buddhist, Hindu, and Taoist communities in various countries. Serving in the Navajo Nation and the Gila River Indian community, Iya found a home among the egalitarian indigenous people of North America. Iya strives to cultivate love and inclusivity and hopes to facilitate the decolonization and subsequent healing of indigenous people. Please enjoy this conversation with Iya Affo. I'm here with Iya Affo. Hello, Iya, and welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course, we're happy to have you. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good.
Well, I've been really looking forward to this opportunity to connect for a couple different reasons. We live just, I think, a stone's throw away.
Oh, yeah.
Here in the Phoenix area.
Yeah. We do. We live real close to each other, so that's fun.
Yeah, and I'm just so happy that you're able to join us. So before we get into learning more about you and your work, we like to ask on this podcast what it is that you hope listeners will get out of our conversation today.
I'm really hoping that people start to understand that things that have happened to our ancestors in the past currently impact us. And this is why we're still talking about the slave trade or the Native American genocide or the colonization for Mexican Americans. We're still talking about it because it still impacts us today. It impacts us through our DNA. It impacts us through our environment, through cultural changes that have happened. But at the same time, we still have the opportunity to mitigate some of that and empower ourselves for healing. And I think those are the things that are really important to understand. So we've gone through a lot of things. We've had adversity in the past, but we still have the opportunity to heal ourselves for future generations.
I love that. We have the opportunity to heal ourselves for future generations. So, yeah, I'm excited to hear more about the work that you're doing. And so if you could tell us a little bit about how you're doing this work in the field of trauma and maybe the ways that you're serving the folks that you work with, we'd love that.
Well, this has been a long journey for me. I feel like growing up, I always had some level of depression and anxiety, despite having a pretty good family and a pretty good upbringing and a lot of opportunity and exposure to a lot of things, the ability to travel, the ability to have the best education. But yet there was still always this depression or anxiety. And I saw it not only in myself, but in many people in my family, and especially the men, the male members of my family, even going back a few generations. So by the time I got pregnant with my first son, it was extremely important for me to understand what happened, what's going on. And so I started really doing a lot of research. And there's a way in which it would have been fantastic if I could have gone to school for, like historical trauma back then. I don't want to age myself too much, but I was born in the early 70s. And so by the time I stumbled upon this work, we didn't have the opportunity to be formally educated about it. So it had to be a lot of boots on the ground, studying, finding anybody that was talking about intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, epigenetics. And when I finally, back in the 90s, heard Dr. Marie Yellowhorse Braveheart Jordan and Dr. Rachel Yehuda out of New York talking about intergenerational trauma from a Native American perspective for Dr. Yellowhorse Braveheart Jordan, and from a Jewish perspective for Dr. Rachel Yehuda, even though it wasn't for our African community, it still made sense. We were all looking at, like the Native American genocide and the Jewish Holocaust and how this impacted people. And so that really got me going. And so I just started studying a lot of that work. And today I provide training on historical trauma and intergenerational trauma. So my company, Heal Historical Trauma, provides a 48-hour, 6-level historical trauma certification program that really focuses on the cultural and neurobiological perspective of historical trauma. And then I work with different organizations from different sectors. So like fire departments and police departments, hospitals, behavioral health, mental health providers, educators. So from all different perspectives, we start to understand historical trauma from many different cultural perspectives, right? Like what happened with Mexican and Mexican Americans, or, Latinx people and Hawaiians, Native Americans, African Americans, what happened in the past and how does that manifest in people today? And I think this is really important work for educators, right? Whose students are walking to the classroom, especially we talked about living very close to each other, right?
Yeah.
And Arizona is just not that diverse. So every time we have a Black child walk into the classroom and they don't find children that look like them, or they don't find a teacher that looks like them, this activates the stress response system. When we activate the stress response system, we're going to shut down the parts of the brain that we need in order to learn, because we start to be in the most primitive part of our brain, which really is just for survival. So if I'm an educator, and of course my heart is to have my students learn and be successful, I need to understand what has happened in the past to African American people. Why are we still talking about the slave trade, right? Why does it matter if there aren't any other students that look like this particular child, or how we teach or how we do things is not in alignment with this child's culture, to make them feel comfortable, to make them feel safe, so that they have full access to their brain and so that they can learn.
Wow, I was getting tingles in my skin just as you were talking about it, especially knowing that you're so close. I'm so glad to know that you're doing this work in our community. And I have a couple questions. I wonder, is your training online? Can just anyone take your training? I mean, I heard you said that you work with different organizations.
Yes, so the 6-level training can be taken by any individual. It's really great. We sometimes have like foster parents and adoptive parents that have like multicultural adoption.
Yeah.
They take the program, and it's been really great for families, all the way up to PhDs and pediatricians and medical doctors take the training. So it's really appropriate for all sectors and all walks of life And I'm told that the way the training is, it's very intuitive and not, so complex. Like it makes sense and it comes from the heart and you can resonate with it. So it's really appropriate for anybody.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I'm excited.
Yeah.
Gonna have to get on your website and hear more. Okay, so you do this training. So you said there's a 6-level training, and that's the main one you have. Do you have other offerings?
That's the main one I have. And it can also be broken down if people are interested in a specific topic. You can just take one level that focuses on the topic that you're interested in. And then I go to different organizations and train organizations as well. So, like police departments, fire department, educators. I go to different tribes and train tribal members about historical trauma, or like human resource department about historical trauma. So yeah, so those are pretty much the trainings. And then sometimes we do trainings on adverse childhood experiences or trauma, just trauma in general, not just specifically historical trauma.
Okay. And could you tell us a little bit more about how you hold or how you define complex trauma in that context that you're working with in terms of the historical and intergenerational?
I really love to define trauma as something that overwhelms the human physiological system. That probably sounds like, big, but we like to think about trauma, right, as an incident or a series of incidents that have happened. And that is what we consider trauma. But we're all very individual. And this goes all the way back to our parents being pregnant with us, right? Or our grandparents, even. So, what we know through epigenetics is that, follow me for a minute, we have grandma, right? Pregnant with mom. Mom, at some point while in utero, has all of the eggs she's ever going to have. So, what happens to grandma impacts grandchild.
Yeah.
Whoa, right?
Right.
So, if grandma goes through some level of trauma, that trauma can impact grandchild, even though grandchild is not even born yet and has not experienced personally what grandma experienced. So we can't just think of trauma as a fire that happened when I was a child or molestation or, we have to understand that trauma is anything that overwhelms our capacity to cope.
Yeah.
And we can have things that happen in the past that cause us to have that trauma imprint, so that even when we come to present day, we might still be behaving as if we were in that traumatic experience. This is all trauma. So we can't just think it's something that's currently happening or something that happened 5 years ago. It really is anything that causes us to exceed our capacity to cope.
Yeah.
So we really have to understand that even if we can't recognize or speak about something that perhaps causes us to have certain behaviors or certain reactions, it doesn't mean that we haven't gone through some level of trauma. It almost doesn't matter what it is that happened. We don't need to remember it. We don't need to repeat it or talk about it. We need to know that, hey, in certain circumstances, I have behaviors that I'm uncomfortable with and I would like to change. And then we look at the neurobiology and how to control that neurobiology, and then we can change behaviors.
I love how you've described that. You've made it sound so simple. I know it's really layered and it's actually really complex, but you've said that in a way that feels like any of us could understand what you're teaching us, what you're sharing with the community in your work.
Yes. I don't know. In some ways, I feel like, it is a little bit simplistic. In our Western culture, we try to make everything so complex and so intellectual and so blah, blah, blah. But it's really been with us since time immemorial. This is not the first time in history that people have been going through adversity. We've been going through adversity. We used to have a lot of tools to manage our adversity, and we no longer have those tools. And so it's becoming a visible issue now because we just don't have the tools anymore to manage adversity like we used to.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that a little bit, about the tools? And I don't know if that's
Yes.
something that's integrated into the work that you do. Do you do any kind of like reconnection with these tools that have
Yes.
been so lost in terms of different cultures have to share with us?
Yes. And it's so funny because there's a cultural piece and then there's a day-to-day piece. So let's talk about them.
Yeah, please.
So here's a great example. Pre-COVID, right? Like we do everything now. We talk about everything pre-COVID, post-COVID, right? Okay. Pre-COVID, I was asked to speak at a conference in Flagstaff. And at lunchtime, they brought in some dancers from the White Mountain Apache tribe. And they came in and they danced and they did this song as well. And it was overwhelming, very, just powerful. And so I asked, I know that that wasn't just a performance, right? I can feel the energy of that. What was that? And one of the dancers explained to me that when the Apache used to go out to war, right? They'd leave the community perhaps and go out to war. And of course, when we're in war, we have to be in fight or flight mode, right? Our stress response is activated because we have to survive. And we're going to see things that could potentially cause us to have trauma, right? We're going to see things that are overwhelming. We're going to do things that are overwhelming. So once they went to war, when the warriors came back home, they would perform that dance and that song. If we think about that in 2022 terms, right? That was their debriefing, right? We know that when we send our soldiers to war, we bring them home and we debrief them. That was their debriefing. That's what they did to restore their neurological regulation before they rejoined the community and rejoined their families, right? So they became regulated before going back home. Because we know that if we are dysregulated, we have behaviors that are aggressive and abusive and hostile, or behaviors that make us want to run away and flee and withdraw, or behaviors that make us, completely shut down and, be completely turned off. So there was a way of doing that through traditional dance and song before people were stripped of their cultural identity, right? But even one step further is at some point, right, we became a society that valued capitalism, growth, and expansion. Everything was about gaining new territory, getting more money, growth. And we stopped prioritizing relationship. So I lived for a while in a very austere lifestyle in India. I lived in an ashram in India with my young son. And during that time, we didn't have any of the comforts of home, right? We lived in a very small flat. We slept on the floor. There was no air conditioning. We didn't have a refrigerator. I had to hand wash all of our clothes. The thing that scared me the most was hand washing these clothes, right? Because I thought, my son is 7. His school uniform is white on Tuesdays. And that's also gym day, PE day. So they're out playing in this red clay dirt, right? So get the idea of the 7-year-old with all the red clay dirt in the white uniform. The way we washed clothes was you'd go down to an area where they had these big rocks, and you would take the clothes and you would hit the clothes on the rock to loosen up the dirt and the debris. And after you spent time hitting the clothes on the rock, you had this scrubber thing, and you would scrub the clothes. So you'd have the banging, the banging, the banging. This, we know now, is neurologically regulating, right? That rhythm, the rhythm of the sound, the rhythm that you make when you're hitting the rock with the clothing. We now know in the field of trauma that this is neurologically regulating. So before we prioritize growth and expansion, right, and we did our own laundry with our hands, we had a way of continuously regulating throughout the day. Going on the long walks to get water is regulating. All of those things, we constantly had activities throughout the day that helped us to neurologically regulate. But once we shift to a system where I take my clothes and I put it in the machine to wash, and I get in the car and I drive, the car could be regulating if we're not dealing with traffic, and all these other things.
Right.
But it's not like walking to the well to get water that takes me 5 miles to walk to. So as we grew as a society, we started to lack all of those ways to regulate ourselves throughout the day. If we don't have the opportunity to regulate ourselves, our window of tolerance becomes smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
If I get up in the morning and the first thing I do is walk to get water, and then I start hand washing my clothes, and then I get involved with whatever chanting and prayer, in that particular tradition, that's how it is, and do whatever chanting and prayer, I've had several opportunities to have my brain release all of the feel-good hormones, right? I've had a lot of dopamine. I've had a lot of serotonin, a lot of endorphin, a lot of oxytocin. That helps me to manage the adversity that I'm going to face later on in the day, right? So if I no longer have those, practices, I'm starting the day already activated a little bit, right? Having stressors.
Yeah.
And I don't have a lot of opportunity to mitigate that with feel-good release, the hormones that make us feel good versus the hormones that keep us dysregulated.
Yeah. I'm thinking about how so many of us might start the day even looking at our phone and opening email, or immediately, rather than going and regulating our systems, we're diving into more stress.
That's right.
Emails and social media and all of that.
Exactly. And so we're diving into stress. So we're starting our day stressed.
Yeah.
Now, if we are people who also have historical trauma back here and current day, oppression, discrimination, racism, hate, on top of maybe socioeconomic issues. If we look at a scale of 1 to 10, and 10 is our capacity, right? 10 is at the top of our tolerance threshold, and we wake up at a 5, and then we open up the computer and we start the stress and the aggravation. By the time we get out of bed, we're at an 8 or a 9, right? It only takes a small thing to push us out of that window of tolerance. And now we're having behaviors that we're uncomfortable with, that embarrass us, and that have us acting in very primitive ways because we are in the most primitive part of our brain. When we see, and I really like to say this so people understand it, when we see people having primitive behaviors, it's not a measure of their civility or of their decency or their intelligence. It really is because they're operating in the most primitive part of their brain, perhaps because they're in that fight or flight response and at the top of their window of tolerance.
That's so vital to know, of course, for ourselves and for anyone that has historical trauma, so that we can hold others with that same understanding. Like you said, when they're having these behaviors, if we can know, okay, that this is likely where that's coming from. It's not that they're not a decent human or whatever. It's coming from someplace else.
Right. It's coming from someplace else, or that their culture is deficit in some kind of way.
Right.
No, we have so many layers. And I think it's appropriate here to talk about how trauma can be passed from one generation to the next, right? And I have to say, even before I go into that, not only can trauma be passed from one generation to the next, but so can positive experiences and benevolence and love and kindness be passed potentially for 14 generations, according to the Cherry Blossom Study, right? So it goes both ways.
I love it.
But let's give an example. Let's talk about it. If we go back 9 generations, and I have my ancestors that are living on the continent of Africa. We came from a place called Dahomey, which is now known as Benin Republic. So I have my ancestor, and he's on the continent going through his day-to-day activities, right? But he has heard that People are stealing Africans off the continent and taking them back to this new world where they're treated very poorly and really getting destroyed. Okay? He's going to start to do his day-to-day life in a very hyper-vigilant state of mind, state of being, because this is survival, right? So suddenly he's looking around. Is everything okay? Am I safe? Maybe his smell changes. Maybe he's able to discern. Is that the smell of an animal? Is that a human smell? Is that a human from my tribe? Is that a human that comes from Europe, right? Because our DNA is going to adapt to the environment in which we are in. So our genetic information doesn't change, the genetic code doesn't change, but how we express that genetic material does change. Okay, so now maybe his hearing. Suddenly, if he hears a stick break, he's going to know if that's an animal that broke that stick or a human that broke that stick. So in this moment, that hypervigilant switch, if we make it very simple, gets flicked on. We need to be hypervigilant for survival. DNA adapts to that because our DNA is always going to adapt in order to survive, right? And if we think about fight or flight response, if we're in survival, if our ability to survive is threatened, we engage the stress response system, the fight or flight. Now we're in the most primitive part of our brain because we need to survive. Now, let's bring that forward 10 generations to my sons. When they walk around, that switch can still be flipped on from 10 generations ago. But not only did we have that, but trauma is cumulative. So then we went through, the racist South, all the layers of trauma that have happened since we were snatched off the continent, and all the way up till, Black men and women being shot in the back today. So they have all of these layers of trauma. And if they don't learn how to control their neurobiology, they will always be walking around, right? At a 5, a 6, a 7. So all it takes is that one little thing to happen to push them over the edge to where they're going to have aggressive behavior or behavior that withdraws or shut it down altogether behavior, right? We have fight, flight, or feign, right? The drop down and play dead, which can manifest in a lot of different ways, right? That shutting down phase. But this can originate all the way back from what happened 10 generations ago on the continent of Africa. This is the other layer that we have to look at when we're talking about trauma.
And that piece that you said, that it's cumulative, that it's like all of these layers that are kind of needing to be peeled back and really examined, and some understanding there. So I'm curious how you do that. I'm wondering if you would share personally or even just experiences in your teaching. Is there anything there that you can share around that?
I'd love to. So I have always struggled with, I know I seem very nice and polite now, but I always say, as nice as I am, that's how fierce, I could also be. And so I've worked a long time to manage what comes out of my mouth and manage my actions, this idea of anger management. So I did all the things, right? I did therapies, I did this, I did that. And I still would find myself that in that moment, I go over the edge and then I say something that I don't want to really say, or I have a behavior that I don't want to have. What I started to learn is that there are things that we can do, and we can leverage our knowledge of the neurological system to allow us to have more opportunity to have a flood of dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, endorphins in our system. And when we do that, it gives us a larger window of tolerance with our stress response system, okay? So for me, as an indigenous African woman, it's important that we wake up before the sun comes up, right? So I wake up every day at 4. When I wake up at 4, I'm having behavior that's in alignment with my values. When we have behavior that's in alignment with our values, it activates the pleasure center of our brain, which then causes us to have dopamine and the feel goods released, which helps us to feel neurologically regulated, right? So that's where I start. Number one, wake up at 4. I then go to the gym from 5 to 6. Going to the gym, I have women that I really, really like that work out with me at that particular time, right?
Yeah.
And one of the biggest ways to mitigate the damage of trauma are relationships, right?
Yeah.
Human connection, relationships.
Yeah.
So I make sure I go at 5 because that's when the women that I really like go. So I have the double dose of I'm having human connection, women I like, instructors that I like, along with physical exercise, which is going to help with my endorphins, right? So now I've gotten up, I've done something that's in alignment with my values. I have had positive human engagement because we always have a great time.
Mm-hmm.
I've then exercised my body. So I get all of the feel-good hormones that get released when you exercise. When I drive home, I'm kind of nerdy with neurology. So I have this nerdy neurology podcast that I listen to.
I love it.
It's about 15 minutes a drive home.
Yeah.
But every time we learn new information, we also get a release of the feel-goods. We get activation of the pleasure center of the brain, and we get dopamine release, so forth and so on. So this is also regulating, right? So just in the beginning, the first hours of my day, I have behaviors that cause me to have a release of the hormones that help my brain to feel safe and regulated.
Wow.
Right? Now, as I move throughout the day, I'm going to face adversity, right? But my window of tolerance is a little bit bigger because I started the day getting that good release of the good hormones. If I encounter adversity, I know when I'm about to go too far with behavior, right? We all have to recognize in our bodies, we all have a signal that says, the stress response system is activated. For me, it's this clutch in my stomach. If I get the clutch, I'm about to act a fool. So I know that if I get that clutch, I need to take a step back. I need to take a breath. I might need to go take a nap. There's some way that I need to take care of myself so that I can calm myself down before I take those next actions, those next steps or behaviors. It's kind of like if someone sends me a text, because, we text and we email back and forth and it can feel aggressive, right? We can't really get the full gist of what somebody's trying to say when we do that. When I get a text message and I say, oh, really? Oh, I can't wait. Oh, yeah. Oh, and I am about to answer. I go, 24 hours, sister. You don't touch that for 24 hours. And I wait a 24-hour period. And if 24 hours comes again and I'm still hyped to answer it, 24 hours again, because I know that what I say next is going to be something that I'm going to want to unsay. And you just can't unsay things.
Can't do it.
So there are tools that we have to use and there are ways that we have to set our life up so that we leverage the understanding of our neurobiology so we can control the stress response in itself. In our country and in our culture, I should say, we often focus on behaviors. So first it was, if you have a poor behavior, we want to lock you up, put you away, isolate you. But even when we focus on the behaviors in a positive way and say, I'm going to reward you. If you do this, I'll give you that. If you do this, I'll give you that. That's all well and good. However, if my neurobiology is in stress response mode, my behavior will always be in alignment with stress response mode, right? Behavior is in alignment with neurobiology. So no matter how much I want that treat that you're going to give me if I behave properly, if I don't learn to control my neurobiology, it doesn't matter what that treat is because my behaviors will remain the same.
Wow, this is really hitting me in a different way. Like, this isn't completely new to me, but what feels most important to me in this moment, I'm hearing that, like, you're not bypassing the historical trauma. You're acknowledging it, you're creating space for that, and you're recognizing this neurobiological piece of we're going to honor what's going to support us in the moment. So I'm really appreciating that duality there of like, we can acknowledge both and we're not bypassing what's happened and what's true and what's real in the past and what is happening in the present. Like, that's what's really landing for me right now.
That's awesome. I'm so glad. I'm really happy to hear that because that's what I want it to be. Like, this thing happened and we can't change that. And that is what it is.
Yeah.
But it's not the end of the story, right? It's not the end of our story. And when we face adversity, that's where we start to have more resilience and a fuller expression of resilience. That's where we grow. So adversity is not always bad, right?
Yeah.
Adversity allows us to have growth and to evolve. We just have to learn how to manage it, and we have to be willing to work at it to manage it.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I love that you're doing this work. This is so cool. Well, I wondered if you could share, because you have talked about this kind of, there's the cultural piece of like supporting, you said you recognize as an African-American woman waking up early in the morning, like there's something there that's supportive for you. So by 7 a.m., you've already engaged with all of these ways that like neurobiologically really support that window of tolerance.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering if there's any stories that you have with folks that you've worked with or in this realm of teaching that also kind of illustrate the work that you're doing, kind of putting it into action, boots on the ground.
Yeah. Another big piece, and especially to support the historical trauma pieces, really has to do with reconnecting to cultural, ancestral, traditional ways of being. So regardless of what culture you come from, right? So I'm not saying, okay, because you're African or you're this, regardless of what culture you come from, there is a way that your ancestors managed adversity. And there's a way that your ancestors did things, all the way down to food ways. We don't realize that food is a form of therapy. It's a healing for people.
For sure.
When you go back to eating the types of foods that your ancestors ate, this is a form of healing trauma and healing you. So we have a lot of people that go back to even just eating in traditional ways that their families ate. And even if we don't take it all the way back, 2 generations, 3 generations, even if we talk about the food that our grandparents cooked, the food that our parents cooked, just connecting back mitigates some of that damage. It's just so hard to sometimes describe, but I can remember, and there's definitely a lot to the food waste stuff, but I can remember living in China. And when I was in America, I never would eat Oreo cookies. Like, that's just, I'm a cookie eater, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
It's just not like an Oreo cookie is probably not my thing. Like, I probably need a fresh cookie, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
When I was in China, I had a problem with Oreo cookies. Like, I continuously ate Oreos. And I realized at some point that it was because I was missing something about home. I was feeling empty a little bit about my roots in the United States. And I needed something that gave me that texture, that flavor, that thing that I was familiar with. And so that was part of how I dealt with the isolation that I sometimes felt in China, because I didn't have, English speakers and blah, 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 blah. But I remember how powerful that was for me to eat Oreo cookies. I'm back in the States now. I don't eat Oreos again. I'm back to not eating them again. But when I was there, that was something that helped me with those emotions.
Wow.
So we have a lot of things. We have, food ways. We have traditional ceremonies and rites of passage things, right? Like, we know in the Jewish community, we still see a lot of bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs and bris ceremonies, the traditional circumcision ceremonies. These are ways that we mitigate the damage of trauma and historical trauma. When I train on our Native American communities, I encourage them to go back to what were some of the ceremonies? What are the rites of passage? What are the naming ceremonies? We have to reconnect you to what your ancestors did, all the way down to how you named your children in order to mitigate some of the damage of trauma. So, all of these things are important. African American people, I know I've seen a lot of people start to travel back to West Africa. I mean, it's popular to travel to Africa, like to do safari in the South or in the East or something like that. But most Africans that came to this country enslaved or who had ancestors that came in chains, we come from West Africa, right? We come from places like Ghana and Benin Republic and Nigeria and Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire. So I've heard a lot of people starting to travel back, even if they don't know exactly where they came from in Africa, but traveling back to West Africa to see some of the places where potentially their ancestors were and where the ships came, and walk that last path that we walked before we got onto some of those ships. And that has been very healing for a lot of African people living in the United States.
Wow. Gosh, I'm just feeling, again, so much appreciation for what I'm learning here. And I'm excited for listeners to hear this conversation and excited for them to explore more of your work and understand even better the historical piece and this neurobiological piece that you're bringing in. And so I just wondered if there was anything else that you would like listeners to know, anything that you've learned in your process as you've learned. I know earlier we were talking and you mentioned that you came to this work not necessarily through your formal education, that it was a real internal impulse that you had to really learn about this. And so I wondered if in that kind of self-education, if there's anything that you would like for listeners to learn.
Yes, I really want to encourage people, because what we know is that at least 60% of the population has gone through some type of childhood adversity. So we know that that's a high number, and that's our lowest number, right? At least 60% of the population has gone through some level of childhood adversity. And it can absolutely be impacting your mental health, your behavioral health, and your physical health.
Yeah.
And you have to know that even if you don't remember what happened, you can change your outcome. And that's really the beauty of all of this work. You don't have to remember it, but when you start to look at your neurobiology, when you start to use different tools and different ways, you're able to move past what has happened to you. And even if you don't have access, like a lot of us don't have access to traditional mental health or behavioral health, keep researching. Research about adverse childhood experiences. Dr. Bruce Perry has a book with Oprah Winfrey, What Happened to You. It's a fantastic read. It will help you to validate some of the ways that you're feeling and some of the things that you're going through, and help you understand how to be kind to yourself and how to be kind to others and how to really support people in this process. We have to move back to a time where we prioritize relationships, because relationships are at the top of healing any type of trauma. So if you're struggling with behaviors, you're struggling with anger management, you're struggling with what you say, you're struggling with addiction, all of those things, at the top of our list, human contact and human relationships. Explore how to have richer relationships and human contact, and get out there and read some of these things. Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey's book is a great place to start, and keep searching, because there is hope for you. And what's even more beautiful is what you do today and how you change your life today has the potential to impact the next 14 generations.
I just got chills with you saying that. That's so beautiful. And
Yeah, thank you.
I just so appreciate the humility and the curiosity that you have for individuals, for communities, for each person's specific experience and how they're relating to it. I just really appreciate that and appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you so much, Iya.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me and having this opportunity to share the information.
And where can folks find you? Where can they find your work and get in touch with? We'll put some links in the show notes, so tell us where to go.
Sure. healhistoricaltrauma.com is my website, healhistoricaltrauma.com. And my email is healhistoricaltrauma@gmail.com.
Wonderful. Thanks again, Iya.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Hey, Transforming Trauma listeners. Please join us starting in September for our online NARM Basics training to learn how to transform trauma. This training is available for helping professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Now more than ever before, it is essential that we learn how to resolve complex trauma and support post-traumatic growth. If you are looking for more advanced training in understanding the impacts of attachment, relational, developmental, and intergenerational trauma, and are working in healthcare, education, substance abuse recovery, or allied fields, join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/online basics. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.